When we talk about massive, catastrophic failures, our minds usually jump to accidents, right? Some unforeseen glitch, a bit of bad luck. But what if the biggest disasters aren't accidents at all? What if they're actually engineered, built from the ground up to fail by the very people who created them?
And look, it's true. Sometimes things just go wrong. A variable nobody could have seen coming. It happens.
But that's not what we're talking about today. We're looking at projects whose collapse was basically a sure thing from day one. They weren't just destined for ruin, it was practically in their design specs. So that's the big question, isn't it? What is the actual blueprint for a guaranteed, predictable catastrophe? To figure that out, we're going to tear down three of the most legendary failures you can find: Victor Frankenstein's creature, the government-run Project Genesis, and the deeply strange case of Baron von Nix. If you really want to understand why something explodes in spectacular fashion, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to look at the ambition that started it all. That's where the cracks first appear. Seriously, the seed of the entire disaster is planted right there at the very start. A project that's born out of pure arrogance or just sheer negligence, it's going to carry those fatal flaws all the way to the finish line. And here are our three main culprits, our architects of ruin. Each one represents a different flavor of flawed ambition. First, you've got Victor Frankenstein, the romantic overreacher who was all about personal glory. Then there's Project Genesis, the institutional plagiarist, driven by pure hubris. And finally, Baron von Nix, the philosophical ascendant, whose lofty ideals basically became a weapon he turned on himself. Frankenstein is the textbook definition of what some philosophers would call a failed Übermensch, a would-be Superman. He's got the brains and the drive to become a god, to literally conquer death. But here's the thing. His mission was never about helping humanity. It was all for him, for his own glory. He had all the power to create, but absolutely zero plan or desire to take responsibility for what he made. Now, Project Genesis had a totally different kind of ambition. It wasn't personal. It was institutional. It was nationalistic. The goal? Cook up a fiercely loyal British superhero. But this wasn't about creating something new. It was about copying something that already worked. It's a classic case of what you'd call methodological laziness. They wanted the shiny prize without putting in the hard work. And then you have the Baron, who takes ambition to a completely different and kind of terrifying level. See, he wasn't trying to build something external at all. His big idea was to solve a deep philosophical puzzle by turning himself into a god. He wanted to systematically tear down his own mind and body to become a being of pure, untethered will. Of the three, his ambition was by far the most radical. So we've got these flawed ambitions, right? It's probably no surprise that those ambitions led directly to some seriously flawed ways of doing things. And that's the connection we've got to make. The why you do something completely dictates how you do it. A goal based on narcissism or laziness or even self-destruction, each one is a guarantee that your methods are going to be just as broken. Frankenstein's method was, let's be honest, disgusting. He literally stitched a person together from scavenged body parts. But the most crucial part of his method is that he created a separate being. This physical distance, this psychological separation, is what allowed him to commit his greatest crime. He just walked away. It was a masterclass in technical skill with a complete, utter failure of ethical planning. The failure of Project Genesis was just as easy to see coming. Their entire process was built on what official reports later called a foundation of dust. They were trying to copy a massive success using nothing but a handful of incomplete notes. This wasn't just a simple mistake, it was pure methodological hubris. They honestly believed a shortcut was the same thing as a blueprint, and that belief guaranteed it would all come crashing down. The Baron's method, though, was all internal. He performed what's been described as a feat of supreme intellectual violence on himself. He wasn't building anything, he was systematically demolishing his own consciousness, hoping he'd come out the other side as a god. It wasn't an assembly line, it was a ritual of self-annihilation. So we have flawed ambitions leading to flawed methods, and now we get to the inevitable results. Let's take a look at the monstrous consequences. You know, the creature's own words here are just heartbreakingly clear. He wasn't born a monster. He started out, as he says, benevolent and good. It was the trauma,
The trauma of being abandoned by his own creator and then hated by everyone he met, that twisted him. Misery, he says, is what made him a fiend. The outcome of Project Genesis was just as catastrophic, but in a totally different way. They created Big Ben, an asset who was so physically deformed and mentally unstable that his own mind built a complete delusion just to survive. He genuinely believed he was a handsome hero on a secret mission because, as the analyst put it, his mind just could not bear the truth of its own deformity. Operationally, he was a total write-off.
But the failure didn't just stop there. Oh no, it got much, much worse. That instability they built right into him, it became the launch pad for something far more dangerous. A single moment of human compassion shattered his fantasy world. And in that instant, the useless asset transformed into a terrifying, uncontrollable, godlike entity called the Will-Made Flesh. Their initial screw-up became the engine for an even bigger catastrophe. The Baron's failure? It gave birth to the most unique monster of them all. Because the experiment was performed on himself, he didn't create an enemy he could fight. Instead, his mind shattered and violently slammed his own ambitious story together with the trauma of a totally different person, a professor named Johannes Diogen. The result wasn't a monster he could run from. He became the monster, a single fractured being named Dervilla, forever locked in a war with himself.
Okay, so we've got an abandoned creature, a delusional soldier who becomes a god, and a fractured philosopher-sorcerer. Let's pull all these threads together and see if we can draw up a clear blueprint for disaster.
When you look at these three very different roads to ruin, what's the common ground? What is the universal architecture of failure?
Well, it turns out there's a pretty clear set of rules. First, ambition that has absolutely no connection to ethics or responsibility. Second, a level of arrogance so high you mistake a shortcut for a real plan. Third, a total failure of what experts call anticipatory ethics, which is just a fancy way of saying you have to plan to take care of the thing you create. And finally, a complete lack of foresight that makes a monstrous outcome not just a possibility, but a certainty. What this all leads to is this toxic cycle of reciprocal monster making. The creator's inner monster, their own ambition without empathy, their neglect, ends up giving birth to an actual external one. In the end, the creator and the creation become these twisted mirror images of each other, trapped in a tragedy of their own making. And all of this leaves us with one final, chilling thought from the philosopher Nietzsche. It perfectly sums up the lesson from our three architects of ruin. In their attempts to conquer death, create a national hero, or become gods themselves, they became the very source of the monsters they should have feared. It's the ultimate proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a creation is the creator.